What happens when a 35-year-old African president walks into a room full of the world's most powerful leaders and refuses to play by their rules? When everyone expects him to beg, but instead, he arrives with a proposal that could reshape an entire continent. Today's story unfolds in the opulent corridors of Riyadh, where billionaires decide the fates of nations over coffee, and where one man's refusal to kneel changed everything. This isn't about wealth. It isn't just about politics. This is about dignity, respect, and what happens when someone dares to rewrite a script the world has already written for him. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a single conversation in Saudi Arabia sent shockwaves across 3 continents and transformed a poor nation into an equal partner overnight. The marble floors of the King Abdulaziz Conference Center shimmered like mirrors, the morning light bouncing off their perfection. Outside, the Riyadh skyline stretched endlessly. Glass towers piercing the heavens, monuments to ambition, oil, and power. Inside, tension hung beneath layers of etiquette. It was March 15th, the Saudi Crown Prince's annual investment summit. But this wasn't just a business meeting. This was where fortunes turned on a handshake, where economies could shift with the nod of one powerful man. The guest list read like a who's who of global dominance. Silicon Valley tech billionaires, oil titans from Houston, German industrial magnates, and world leaders whose signatures could tilt the balance of global trade. At exactly 9 a.m., Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman entered the Grand Hall. At just 38, he had already remade Saudi Arabia's economy, launched trillion-rial megacities, and rebranded his kingdom as a nexus of East and West. His vision 2030 wasn't just transforming the Middle East. It was reshaping the world. Today, he would decide which global ventures were worthy of Saudi Arabia's $2 trillion public investment fund. The delegates had arrived since dawn. Private jets lined the tarmac at King Khalid International like luxury sedans at a gala. Each arrival came with glossy proposals, grand promises, and plans for everything from AI systems and smart cities to space tech and green energy. Everyone wanted a slice of Saudi capital. Among the high-powered names were a few surprises. Singapore's president came to discuss the semiconductors. Brazil pitched agri-tech. Even Estonia came offering digital governance solutions. But buried in the agenda, an afterthought, was one name that raised more than a few eyebrows. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. The murmurs started. Burkina Faso? That tiny, landlocked country in West Africa? A nation with a GDP smaller than some attendees' investment portfolios? A country with crumbling infrastructure, limited exports, and barely a footprint in global finance? What's he even doing here? Whispered the German delegation. What does Burkina Faso have that Saudi Arabia could possibly want? What no one realized then was this. That question was about to be answered, and the answer would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, partnership, and possibility. Morning sessions followed a predictable rhythm. PowerPoints, statistics, graphs, well-groomed executives in tailored suits giving polished pitches. The Crown Prince listened attentively, asked sharp questions, and offered diplomatic nods of interest. It was business, efficient, transactional, cold. Then came lunch. Delegates clustered in polished knots, trading buzzwords and business cards. Saudi officials floated like courteous ghosts, ever gracious, never vulnerable. And that's when Ibrahim Traoré finally arrived. He was nothing like what they expected. At 35, he was younger than most CEOs in the room, but he walked with a calm certainty, unhurried, unshaken. And he wore not a Western suit, but the military dress uniform of his country, not as a performance, not as a spectacle, but as a statement of origin, identity, and intent. The fabric was modest, the cut far from flawless, but his presence, undeniable. He didn't dart through the crowd shaking hands or peddling introductions. He simply observed, quietly waiting. By afternoon, most attendees were counting down to dinner. The Crown Prince sat through hours of jargon-filled speeches, his attention waning. Phones buzzed, flights were checked. Some had already begun slipping out. Then came the final speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The applause was tepid at best. This felt like a formality, a gesture toward inclusivity, a box checked. Even the crown prince leaned back in his chair, resigned. Traoré approached the podium. No slides, no documents, no devices. Just him. He paused, let the silence grow until the room leaned forward. Then he spoke. Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests, I have a question. When you close your eyes and imagine the future, what do you see? The room stirred. No formalities. No thanks for the invitation. No statistics. Do you see taller buildings? Faster machines? Or do you see people standing taller, walking prouder, dreaming bigger? Even the crown prince looked up. For 6 hours, I've listened to brilliant ideas. Metrics, profits, margins. All vital, all smart. But I've heard little about the one resource that truly generates wealth. Human potential. He stepped closer to the crowd. Your Highness, your kingdom has invested wisely. Silicon Valley, Europe, Asia. But may I ask, when was the last time you invested in raw human hunger? A ripple passed through the crowd. I come from a place most of you can't find on a map, he said. Burkina Faso, land of the upright. No oil, no diamonds, no ports. But we have something far rarer. People who haven't yet learned what can't be done. He pulled a weathered photo from his jacket. This boy, Musa, is 10. Until 3 months ago, he had never seen electric light. His village had no grid. When the sun set, life stopped. Then we installed a single solar panel. Not with aid, not with loans. With money we earned, through smart reforms in agriculture and mining. He held up the photo. And do you know what Musa said when the light came on? Silence. He looked at his father and said, now we can study after sunset. Now we can build. Traoré paused. That boy didn't ask for games or television. He asked for tools. To build. To learn. To create. He walked the stage slowly, meeting eyes. That photo isn't just a memory. It's a map of what's possible when capital meets conviction. He stopped in front of the Crown Prince. Your Highness, you've spoken of Vision 2030, of moving beyond oil. You've invested in tech, tourism, AI, all wise. But what if your kingdom's greatest opportunity isn't replacing oil with data? What if it's investing in something even more powerful? The human engine that hasn't yet been given the chance to ignite. The hall was still. No fidgeting. No phones. Just a room full of powerful people, suddenly unsure of who held the real power. And that was how a 35-year-old from one of the world's poorest countries walked into the wealthiest room on earth and changed the conversation forever. The boldness of those words rippled across the chamber. Delegates shifted in their seats. Some glanced at each other with uneasy curiosity. No one, especially not leaders of modest economies, spoke to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman like this. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't finished. Africa is not here begging, he said. We are not a continent asking for handouts. We are 54 nations with more than 1 billion people, most under the age of 25. The youngest, hungriest, most energetic population on Earth. And we live on a landmass rich in minerals, fertile soil, and renewable energy. But what truly sets Africa apart? We are still writing our story. With those words, he pulled out a tablet, his first use of technology, and cast a simple image on the massive screen, a map of Africa with dotted lines stretching from the west coast to the east. This, he said, pointing to the display, is the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor, a continental lifeline. 8,000 kilometers of highways, railroads, power lines, and fiber optic cables linking Dakar to Djibouti, 12 nations. One vision, the largest infrastructure undertaking in African history. Not conceived by foreign consultants, but designed by African minds. The atmosphere in the hall shifted. Phones were set down. Chatter stopped. Delegates leaned in. The entire room was listening now. The total project cost is $800 million. Traoré continued. Less than what Saudi Arabia spends on a single luxury resort. But the return? Transformational. He painted the vision clearly. West Africa's farmlands flowing to East Africa's ports. Saharan sun fueling cities from Senegal to Sudan. Students in remote villages tapping into global knowledge through high-speed internet. The Crown Prince, who had listened passively to countless presentations that day, now leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his expression focused. Traoré returned to the heart of his message. But this isn't only about African development. This is about you. This is about Saudi Arabia stepping into its highest role, not as a regional giant, but as a global connector. He turned toward the Crown Prince again. Every ton of cargo passing through this corridor could move through Saudi ports. Every watt of power could be amplified by Saudi solar technology. Every byte of data could ride on Saudi-built networks. On the next slide, trade flow projections, logistical models, ROI forecasts. Even conservative estimates predict a 400% rise in trade between Africa and the kingdom in a single decade. But more importantly, Your Highness, this makes Saudi Arabia the bridge between Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Traoré's presentation now weaved technical insight with a human message. Not patronage, he said. Partnership, not aid. Investment, not transactions. Transformation. He clicked off the presentation and returned to center stage. Your Highness, he said, now standing fully in the light. Great nations are remembered not for what they amassed, but for what they built. The Egyptians built pyramids. The Romans, roads. The British, ships. So I ask you, what will Saudi Arabia build? He paused. I propose you build bridges. Not only of steel or stone, but of possibility. Human bridges. Economic bridges. Bridges between the world's youngest continent and its most ambitious kingdom. The room was wrapped. No longer was it seen as a routine speech from a minor state. It was now a high-level strategic pitch with global implications. And then Traoré did something no one expected. He stepped back, closed the tablet. And with no screen, no graphs, no notes, he spoke, clear, direct from the soul. But allow me to be honest, he said. I did not come here today primarily to ask for your investment. Confusion flickered across faces. The Crown Prince straightened. I came to offer you something far more valuable. A place in history. A pause. Not as a kingdom that grew rich on oil, but as the kingdom that helped others grow rich on their own terms. Not a buyer of loyalty, but a builder of respect. He moved forward slowly. This corridor will be built, with or without you. Our governments are committed. Chinese partners are engaged. European investors are interested. American firms are studying feasibility. Then came the thunderclap. We do not need rescue. We need partnership. A hush fell. He was telling one of the richest nations in the world. Your participation is welcome, but not essential. If Saudi Arabia joins, he said, you're not simply investing in roads. You're investing in the idea that wealth creates more wealth when it is shared. Traoré walked toward the Crown Prince's table, not with deference, with equality. Your Highness, you've spoken often of Vision 2030, but I ask you to imagine Vision 2050, not just a reformed Saudi Arabia, but a redefining Saudi Arabia. He spoke now as if he were painting with words. Imagine Saudi firms growing with African entrepreneurs, Saudi students studying in African universities that you helped build, African researchers working in Saudi labs, labs constructed with minerals sourced from African soil. This wasn't charity. It was synergy. South cooperation on a scale never attempted before. This, he said, is why I came without slides, without consultants, without a delegation. I came alone, to speak leader to leader, to propose a future between equals. He stopped just a few feet from the Crown Prince, close enough to speak privately, but loud enough for all to hear. Your Highness, Traoré said, his voice unwavering, Saudi Arabia's legacy will not be the tallest building, not the fastest train, not even the most advanced AI. Your true legacy will be proving that the greatest power is not in owning markets, but in creating them, not in controlling resources, but in developing them, not in buying respect, but in earning it. The room was absolutely still. Everyone sensed it. This was either the most courageous diplomatic act they'd ever witnessed, or a catastrophic misstep. And then the silence was broken. The Crown Prince rose. Deliberate, measured. I have heard thousands of pitches in the past 5 years, he said. Each one focused on what Saudi Arabia could offer. Our capital, our markets, our influence. He looked directly at Traoré. You are the first to ask what Saudi Arabia could become. Now standing fully, he turned to the room. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have witnessed is the kind of thinking that defines the next century of global development. President Traoré has not asked us to solve Africa's problems. He has invited us to be part of Africa's solutions. The room buzzed. People sat straighter. This, the Crown Prince said, is the very essence of Vision 2030, mutual respect, shared growth, and long-term partnership. He walked over to Traoré. Mr. President, he said with clarity, Saudi Arabia will commit $500 million to the first phase of the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor. Further investment will follow, contingent on milestones and collaboration among partner nations. Audible gasps broke the room's stillness. It was more than money. It was a shift in mindset. But he wasn't finished. In addition, he continued, Saudi Arabia will establish a permanent African Partnership Office in Riyadh, a dedicated hub to explore and support South-South cooperation. And then, an unprecedented gesture. President Traoré, I invite you to chair the advisory board of this new initiative. Stunned silence. Never before had an African head of state been offered such a role, not as a guest, but as a strategic partner in shaping Saudi policy. Traoré nodded once, not in surprise, but with the calm of someone who knew this moment would come. Because this moment wasn't about capital. It wasn't about contracts. It was about respect. And in that moment, in the marble halls of Riyadh, beneath chandeliers and billion-dollar suits, a new future quietly began. It would be remembered as the moment the global South stopped competing and started cooperating. The moment wealth became a tool to create more wealth, not merely a measure to accumulate it. For the first time all day, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman smiled genuinely. Mr. President, he said, I believe you're absolutely right. And I believe this partnership will benefit both our nations far more than either of us can currently imagine. The official session ended with polite applause, but the real momentum began in the quiet corners of the room. In the hallway conversations, the exchange cards, the whispers of possibility. Delegates from across Africa rushed to speak with Traoré. They didn't want photos. They wanted in. European and American representatives grew suddenly alert, calculating how this unexpected Saudi-African axis might shift global alliances and trade routes. But the day's most important moment wasn't recorded on video. As the conference hall emptied, the Crown Prince approached Traoré alone. Mr. President, he said quietly, your speech today wasn't just impressive, it was necessary. Saudi Arabia has long sought authentic partnerships. Today, you showed us what that truly looks like. Traoré nodded. Your Highness, we've learned that dignity is more valuable than charity, and partnership is more powerful than patronage. Today, we showed the world that this isn't just theory, it works. They shook hands, not as formality, as commitment. The gesture wasn't just diplomatic, it was historic. And outside the towering glass walls of the Riyadh summit, the world reacted instantly. African stock markets rallied. Investors sensed something real. Saudi-backed infrastructure development wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Social media erupted with clips of Traoré's speech. Young Africans posted with captions like, "This is leadership." Finally, someone who speaks as an equal. This changes everything. Global headlines followed. Western outlets fixated on geopolitical tension. Would the Saudi-African pact undermine Western influence? Chinese media focused on competitive implications for their Belt and Road Initiative. Middle Eastern coverage? It celebrated this as proof of Saudi Arabia's evolving leadership in the global South. But Africa's response? That was different. Within 48 hours, presidents and prime ministers across the continent were on the phone, calling Riyadh, calling Ouagadougou, eager to join. The president of Senegal requested a meeting to discuss linking Dakar to the corridor. Ethiopia inquired about integrating existing infrastructure into the network. South Africa proposed contributing industrial and logistical expertise. And this time, the interest wasn't just ceremonial. These were not scripted diplomatic platitudes. These were serious invitations to participate in something new, something African-born. Back in Ouagadougou, the energy was electric. Families gathered around radios and television sets to hear the news. Burkina Faso, a nation often left out of international headlines, had just stood shoulder to shoulder with one of the world's wealthiest kingdoms. For many citizens, the symbolism was powerful. But for Traoré, the work was just beginning. A handshake in Riyadh means nothing, he told reporters, unless we deliver results in Africa. Partnership is proven through performance, not promises. And with that mindset, his administration shifted from vision to execution. The first step? The Trans-Sahel Coordination Office, established in the capital and jointly staffed by Burkinabe officials and Saudi advisors. Its mission? Turn the dream of the 8,000-kilometer corridor into reality within 5 years. Saudi Arabia kept its word. Within 3 months, Saudi engineers were conducting on-the-ground feasibility studies. Construction firms were bidding on tenders. Saudi banks were linking with African financial institutions. But most crucially, this wasn't just about Saudi investment. It was about shared expertise. Burkinabe engineers collaborated directly with Saudi technicians. African economists shaped implementation plans. Local firms were given priority for construction contracts. This wasn't top-down development. It was co-creation. And that difference was massive. For decades, African development had meant dependency on colonial powers, on Cold War blocs, on foreign loans with strings attached. But this was something else entirely. A South-South partnership based on mutual advantage, not power imbalance. And young Africans noticed, across the continent, students began to rethink international relations. Universities launched new programs in global South diplomacy. Think tanks released papers exploring alternative models for growth. 6 months later, the first section of the Trans-Sahel corridor officially broke ground. No red carpets, no foreign dignitaries, just local workers, regional engineers, and community leaders. Traoré's speech that day was short but unforgettable. Today, we don't just break ground for a road. We break ground for a new kind of future, one where partnership replaces patronage, where dignity replaces dependency, and where the Global South writes its own story. Construction proceeded with remarkable efficiency. The project created tens of thousands of local jobs. It delivered measurable progress, on time, under budget. It built not just roads, but skills and confidence. By the end of the first year, trade between Saudi Arabia and Africa had increased by 60%. Multiple nations were replicating the model. The corridor's influence was already rippling beyond the continent. Brazil entered discussions with Nigeria on agri-logistics. India expanded its East African tech partnerships. Mexico began trade talks with North Africa manufacturing hubs. What had started as a single moment in Riyadh was quickly becoming a movement that challenged old paradigms, a movement that proved the Global South did not need to wait for permission to lead. But the biggest success wasn't measured in GDP or miles of highway. It was in how nations now viewed each other. Aid was no longer the default currency. Respect was. Crown Prince bin Salman reflected on that change at the partnership's 1-year anniversary. President Traoré taught us something profound. True leadership doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from asking the right questions. He didn't ask us to save Africa. He invited us to become part of Africa's solutions. And in doing so, he helped us rediscover the meaning of partnership. Meanwhile, Traoré continued to lead with quiet resolve. When asked about his historic achievement, he deflected attention. This partnership worked because it was built on truth, not flattery, on mutual benefit, not charity, on respect, not pity. And those values can work anywhere, if leaders are brave enough to embrace them. What began as a moment had evolved into a model, a new kind of diplomacy, a new kind of development, a new way forward for countries long dismissed by the traditional global order. And in Gango, the quiet village where it all began, the changes were already visible. The boy in the photo, Musa, was now studying under electric light, dreaming of becoming an engineer. A child whose life was once dimmed by darkness, now illuminated by possibility. His story had become the symbol of a new truth. That dignity is more valuable than charity. That partnership is more powerful than patronage. And that when leaders act with courage and conviction, they don't just change policies, they change history.